In the remote wilderness of Canada, a twisted nightmare unfolded. A man who called himself a prophet led his followers down a path of unthinkable horror. This is the true story of the Anthill Kids, a cult so disturbing it defies belief. The Anthill Kids cult wasn't the largest or the most well-known, but it may be one of the most brutal. Led by Roch Thériault, a self-proclaimed messiah with a god complex, this isolated commune became the site of unimaginable cruelty, all in the name of salvation. Roch Thériault was born in 1947 in Saguenay, Quebec, into a devout Catholic family. He was intelligent, articulate, and had an unusual charm, even as a boy. But there was something darker beneath the surface. He hated authority, craved attention, and believed deeply that he was destined for something greater. By the time he reached his 20s, Thériault had grown tired of traditional religion. He saw flaws in the church, but instead of abandoning faith entirely, he twisted it into something he could control. He joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 1970s, but not for salvation. He liked the strict rules, the apocalyptic tone, and most importantly, the vulnerability of those who followed. His sermons were passionate, dramatic, and terrifying. He warned of doom, of nuclear war, and divine wrath, and slowly people started listening. In the remote wilderness of Burnt River, Ontario, Roch Thériault's vision began to take shape. Here, isolated from society, he believed he could build his own kingdom, a pure, holy refuge from the sinful world. He called it Eternal Mountain. There were no roads, no electricity, no running water, just the forest, the cold wind, and the will of one man. The followers worked tirelessly, day and night, building crude cabins from logs, cooking over open fires, raising tents from scrap materials. Roch called them the Anthill Kids, a name he gave them after watching how hard they worked, scurrying around like insects to please him. To outsiders, it may have looked like a humble, off-grid community, but inside, a toxic hierarchy was already forming. Roch placed himself above everyone, as both a spiritual leader and the ultimate authority. The Anthill Kids didn't just follow his teachings, they worshipped him. Thériault began to strip away their identities, banning books, cutting them off from family, removing mirrors from the camp so they couldn't even see themselves. He shaved heads as a form of humiliation. He dictated when they could eat, sleep, and even speak. And while his followers starved, Roch dined in excess. He claimed God gave him different rules, that as the chosen one, he was allowed to indulge while others fasted for their sins. He drank heavily, despite forbidding it. He slept with any woman he pleased, claiming it was divine will. By the early 1980s, what had started as a religious commune had morphed into something far more dangerous. Roch Thériault wasn't just leading a group, he was creating a cult, one built on labor, pain, obedience, and blind faith. They were isolated, indoctrinated, and completely under his control. And they still believed they were the lucky ones, the chosen few, destined to survive the apocalypse. But what they didn't know was that the real apocalypse was already inside the camp. As the years passed, Thériault's teachings grew more extreme, and his behavior became increasingly violent. What began as a spiritual commune had now become a personal kingdom of torment. He no longer pretended to lead by faith. Now, he ruled by fear. Punishment became a daily ritual. Followers were beaten with belts, fists, or blunt tools for disobedience, or sometimes for no reason at all. He claimed it was God's correction. Roch Thériault's punishments were theatrical, public, humiliating, and ritualistic. One man who smoked a cigarette was stripped naked and left outside in the freezing cold. Another was forced to cut off his own toe with a knife, while Roch watched, calling it a test of loyalty. PL began to believe that pain meant purification. And the children, even they weren't spared. Born into the cult, they grew up in an environment of constant fear and violence. They saw their mothers tortured, their fathers shamed, and were taught that Roch was the ultimate authority, above parents, above government, above God. Followers were made to crawl like animals, eat off the ground, or be tied to trees for hours at a time. One woman was punished by having a naked child placed on a hot wood stove while she was forced to watch. Roch called it discipline. In reality, it was sadism disguised as divine justice. But perhaps the most terrifying part of Thériault's control was his obsession with playing doctor. With no medical training, he performed horrific operations on his followers, often while they were fully conscious. He pulled out teeth with pliers. He poured alcohol into open wounds. He cut off limbs using only a hunting knife. To him, it wasn't just punishment, it was power. He claimed he could heal with his hands, that pain cleansed the soul. But every surgery left his followers more broken, more traumatized, and more dependent on him for salvation. Even the women he declared wives, many of them underage, were subjected to constant sexual abuse. He said their wombs were sacred vessels for God's children, but every child born was another soul trapped in a hell they never asked for. By now, they no longer saw the outside world as real. Roch had made them believe that he was the only truth, that to live was to die in sin, and many believed him. This was no longer just a cult. It was a prison of the mind, body, and soul. And yet, the worst was still to come. By the mid-1980s, the anthill kids were no longer people. They were shells, broken, battered, spiritually drained. They had been manipulated, starved, beaten, and brutalized until they saw their pain not as torture, but as love. They told themselves this was God's plan, that Roch's punishments were sacred trials, that their suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife. And the more they suffered, the more convinced they became that he was right. This is what real psychological captivity looks like. They were isolated from the world, no phones, no news, no family. Their days were filled with endless labor, emotional confusion, and spiritual warfare. Their sense of self slowly eroded. They weren't just afraid to leave. They believed they couldn't survive without Roch. Parents began teaching their children not to cry, not to complain, because punishment could come at any moment. Babies were sometimes beaten for fussing. Kids were raised to worship Roch as their true father. Roch, meanwhile, was descending deeper into madness. He declared himself not just a prophet, but a living God. He would drink heavily, preach nonsense, and demand loyalty through acts of pain. He burned skin, nailed people to trees, performed mock crucifixions. And still, they stayed. To enforce obedience, Roch began inventing his own Bible. He rewrote scripture to suit his needs. He told his followers that anyone who left would be struck dead by God, or worse, cursed to eternal torment. And after years of psychological warfare, They believed it. When one follower tried to escape, Roch sent others to retrieve him. When they returned, the man was beaten, tied up and tortured. Not just by Roch, but by the very people he once called family. They had become complicit in their own captivity. They weren't just victims anymore. They were enablers, survivors, prisoners of belief. And by now, even the lines between right and wrong had completely disappeared. To survive, they began to believe the abuse was necessary, that it was better to accept his anger than risk eternal damnation. And so the line between mercy and cruelty blurred until they couldn't see it anymore. Roch had lost touch with reality. He would drink for days, then preach about apocalyptic fire and the sins of the world. Sometimes he'd force followers to strip naked and dance around the fire to prove they were free from shame. Other times, he'd punish someone just to make a point. He said he could see the devil in people's eyes. He claimed only he could remove it. He'd perform mock exorcisms, screaming, spitting, hitting. And after hours of torment, he'd embrace the victim and declare them saved. And yet, no one left. No one ran. Not because they couldn't, but because, after all this time, they didn't know they were allowed to. One brave soul finally escaped. She walked for hours through the forest with her baby in her arms until she reached the nearest town. When the police heard her story, they thought it was delusion. But when they arrived at the camp, reality was worse. Authorities found the camp littered with evidence of torture. Scorched bone fragments, restraints, blood-stained tools. Children were malnourished, terrified. Adults were confused, hypnotized. And Roch still claimed he was a prophet. In 1993, he was convicted of murder, life in prison. But even behind bars, he continued manipulating those who still wrote to him. He was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate in 2011. A quiet end to a loud and monstrous life. Most of the victims, their names were lost under headlines that only remembered the monster. But their pain, their survival, deserves to be remembered. It's been decades since the Anthill Kids disbanded. Most of the survivors changed their names. Some moved to cities. Some disappeared into forests once again. Not all survived the silence. They left behind no public memoirs, no confessions, only fragments of artwork, letters, forgotten interviews. What they couldn't say in words, they tried to bury in routine. But trauma doesn't vanish when the gates open. It lingers. For cult survivors, healing is not a destination. It's a long, uneven path. Many suffer from dissociation, nightmares, identity confusion. They don't just struggle to move on. They struggle to understand who they were before it all began. And then there's the guilt. Survivors often carry a burden heavier than the abuse itself. The belief that they allowed it to happen, that they stayed too long, that they didn't protect their children. But this is the lie their abuser planted, and it's the one that takes the longest to kill. The Anthill Kids were victims, not of belief, but of control. And their scars remain etched not just in their bodies, but in the systems that failed to save them. But scars don't mean the story is over. Scars mean you lived. And to the survivors still trying to reclaim their voice, this story is for you.